Mike Spaeth, Global Vice President of USAII. Welcome on Geospatial FM.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. We've talked in the past, and most of my career has been somewhere between space and financial services and strategy. So following your work and your podcast, working in both geospatial and intelligence and AI and sustainability, I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, it's a huge win for the podcast and for this investigative effort, really, for me and the listeners about applications of machine cognition, artificial intelligence in geospatial. So yeah, to already have a guest like you on is a huge boon. Okay, so I understand you're fairly new to this role. Could you unpack it a bit for us, what your responsibilities are and actually what the acronym is, USAII?
Definitely. And, I've been lucky to work with great teams at Maxar and Moody's and Earth Daily on the geospatial side. And in addition to how satellite data can be used for artificial intelligence. And now in my new role, I'm leading the strategy at the United States Artificial Intelligence Institute, where we really focus on building out the next generation of AI talent. And we do that in many ways: training, consulting, AI certifications. And it gets me excited in the morning to, because I'm fired up about geospatial and AI and how they're, finally coming together in a real way. And it's not just, maps and pretty pictures anymore. There's really insights that can be derived via AI that can help people make smarter decisions, specifically climate action and agriculture and national security. So looking forward to diving deeper into some of those things today.
Yeah, sure. So could you give us a bit more detail on what role USAII plays in the world, perhaps in the US, in the technology space and in geospatial, if at all?
Yeah, so it's really about upskilling or reskilling employees and citizens on AI, right? Because obviously it's going to play a major role in the success of companies and countries. And we work closely with sovereigns, governments, educational institutions, corporations, and working with their employees and citizens, training them on AI and providing them with certifications in AI. And how you get certified in AI from USAII is through reviewing our content, videos, books, and then we have exams. And in some cases, we also have reports that need to be submitted that we review. And then once you go through the programs, you receive a certification that can help you in your current role, in your career, getting into college, graduating from college, and getting into the workforce.
Yeah, I was having a look at them before, and they sound really interesting, actually. It's probably the hottest topic in any sort of workplace at the moment. So I think a lot of us would have an interest in these certifications. So could you give us a bit of detail on what they are, how many there are, which one is best for what?
Sure. So as an example, there are specific certifications on the technical side, in addition to certifications on the executive leadership side. You obviously, leaders may not understand the latest in Python, but there are technical people who want to start there and end there on the technical side. So we kind of separate them based on your role in the organization and really what you want to accomplish. And you can, they can also be customized. So, we work very closely with over 130 different countries, and we can customize the criteria and the curriculum based on their specific needs.
Okay. It sounds like you really have a global remit. You said you're working with sovereigns, so I take that to mean governments around the world. Have you got any examples of those?
Yeah, currently we're working very closely with the government in Malaysia also Bahrain, done a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, but across the board, whether it's the EU, South America, North America, United States, Canada, we do certifications for within all of those countries, in very different, in many different types of setups and models.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I mean, I'm just imagining, you in a week, if you're skipping around those different countries, you must have all sorts of information about the themes in a given country where they want to apply AI. It'd be interesting to see how they vary across countries.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for countries to, make a big impact for their companies and for their citizens. Who knows who's going to be the next country to be in the top 5 of, AI skill sets, and how that will enable them to act on the global stage.
Yeah, I mean, because I remember in the news recently there was a new, I think, open AI data center that was being built in Abu Dhabi. So it makes me wonder if that sort of activity will then follow on to interest in that country talking with USAII, to then have their population make use of those kinds of data centers. Is that sort of how it goes?
Yeah, that's correct. And some countries like Saudi Arabia are even looking at, or even done, getting access to OpenAI and ChatGPT for all of their residents. I think there's even talk about paying the $20 subscription fee for every resident, and things like that, will make a big difference in how the company once again succeeds on the global stage.
That's absolutely amazing. But so that's $20 a month. There's almost like a new tax on
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Okay, all right. So that's how countries get an edge these days. Okay, we really are at the center of things. Okay, cool. So good to have that background on this new global organization that's providing some upskilling, really, and I think reskilling was another term that relates here, to do with artificial intelligence. So as the name says, this podcast and this investigative effort is about geospatial foundation models. I understand from your career, Mike, you've had a lot to do with them. Could you tell us what a geospatial foundation model is?
Sure. In the case of on the geospatial side, it's taking advantage of any sensing data, like the example being satellite data. There's a vast amount of data currently being collected from satellites, not just on a daily basis, but if you look back, the amount of data that's in the archive historically goes back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So this level of data and this granular data can be used to be able to do the training of the models, to give the model an understanding of the physical world. An example is you can take a look at soil moisture and how that changes on a daily basis. And once again, the language models, the LLMs, have been trained on the internet, and that has been exhausted. So having a data set this size is just a ripe data set to be able to train a model that can be then used in a multimodal way with an LLM to be able to query the earth. An example is, you could find out where is it most likely to be a wildfire across the globe. The obvious answer is parts of Canada, California, but maybe there are other locations.
Don't forget the whole of Australia.
That's correct. That's correct.
Isn't that the standard way to show Australia, as a map covered in fire?
Yes, yes. But maybe where is the place we would never expect? And
Right.
this type of data used in a GeoAI fashion can find that area and enable us to get ahead of it. And maybe that's a combination of many different variables that we don't see or we don't understand that the AI model will and could, and then we can be able to, mitigate that before there's a wildfire, before the wildfire starts or spreads.
Okay, you have you have a great way of bringing urgency to this new development and this advancement really in technology and understanding for our species. Okay, so naturally, my next question is, do you have any examples of where we gained a capacity to make new valid predictions about natural disasters?
Yeah, so we're as an industry on the geospatial side, and where I came from on the Earth observation side, it's still in its infancy. So the first model that came out was the IBM NASA Prithee model, and if we look back and see when that project started, it's almost 3 to 4 years ago, and you get to understand how forward-looking IBM research was and NASA was to be able to start that process. And the fact that they did start it that long ago has given them a substantial edge. And there are many different, new players to the market. I know AI2, Allen Institute is working on geospatial foundation models, obviously Microsoft, Google, and others. But it's really that initial idea that came from IBM and NASA that started the process. And as I mentioned, we're still in the early stages. Use cases have been formulated. Use cases have been decided on being the top three. One of the projects that I worked on was specifically around methane detection, and in the western parts of the United States. And it focused on not just satellite data, but drone data, ground truth, really any remote sensing data to feed into the foundation model to do predictions of, where there will be potential methane leaks by kind of understanding where the leaks are, some of the different characteristics. So that is one use case I know that is in progress. But once again, it's early days. But I see AI as being really this potential savior for the Earth observation satellite industry, because of the amount of data that the industry collects and the amount of data needed by the Googles and the Microsofts of the world to be able to feed the models and be able to train the models so the models are able to learn over time. So
Right.
It seems like a perfect marriage.
You used the word save there, and I'd like to dig into what the meaning of this word might be. I think at least in terms of the markets and my view on things from my previous podcast, the Geospatial Index, one of the first things I noticed when I was creating that index is how all of the Earth observation SPACs from just after COVID, they might have listed at $10, but they pretty promptly went down to about $1. Do you have any more to say about this phenomenon? And yeah, if you could expand more on this emergence of GFMs may cause those profits to go up and consequently the share prices.
Yeah, and maybe save is a strong word, but what I found, being in the industry at Maxar and Earth Daily and even Moody's, where we use satellite data to be able to monitor potential areas of risk, is that the industry has been operating in a model in many different areas for the same way for the past 50 years. And, the industry is focused on more like, hey, Houston, we have a problem historically, instead of, hey, Silicon Valley, we have a lot of data. So that really enables a new area of revenue for the satellite companies, because their area of revenue has been very similar, right? It's been sovereigns, it's been governments as the large customers, right? And those large customers have been served very well, and there's been fantastic use cases. But those large customers, there needs to be an expansion outside of those handful of customers that the industry serves. And and AI can be the area that potentially saves the industry because of the need to expand outside of those government use cases.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a phenomenon of essentially these hyperscalers inhaling the Earth. And yeah, these Earth observation companies have the Earth to sell in a sense.
That's a great way to describe it.
Yeah.
Being able to inhale that data about the Earth on a daily basis and an hourly basis, and being able to feed that into the model. And the model's insatiable, right? AI is insatiable. The more it's easy to understand. The more data, the better it learns, the better it's able to provide value.
So, Mike, whilst I've got you on the show, I wanted to mine your experience at Maxar and Earth Daily a bit. Could you give us a few reflections on your time in those roles that you had at each of those firms? And maybe tell us what your role was and what sort of answers you gave customers, if there were any frustrations or common patterns of failure or success.
Yeah. And so during my time at Maxar and Earth Daily, even though both were satellite operators, their satellites performed in a different way, which over time I learned what that difference was. So Maxar's satellites had high resolution, went down to 30 centimeter. Earth Daily had high daily revisit at 5 meters. And each different satellite has its specific benefit based on revisit and resolution. Now, that took me a long time to learn those differences. When I joined the industry from Moody's, I thought, satellites, they're all the same. They all do the same thing. And only over time did I understand that difference. And I think that learning curve was high, and we have to understand and not expect our customers to have to go through that same journey. They're all going into these conversations of thinking they're all the same. And we can't get in, one of the things I saw is you can't get caught up in the, hey, this satellite is super cool. It's got 30 centimeter and SWIR veneer data and blah, blah, blah. We understand those words and that language, but they don't. And that's really what, one of the major issues and the disconnect between the satellite companies and their actual customers. Coming into the industry, we use some satellite data from Planet at Moody's, but one of the biggest advantages is that I didn't know all these terms, right? And you're coming to an industry where it's been pretty much the same companies and the same people working in these companies for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And not many people start mid-career in the satellite industry. It's a pretty closed community. And because it's closed, they all talk that same language, thinking the entire world doesn't. So, I think it was my first week at Maxar, I took a look and see who the thought leaders were, and came to Aravind from TerraWatch, and he was gracious enough to spend some time with me my first 2 weeks. And one of the things he said is, your biggest advantage is that you don't know the industry, right? He goes, because this industry needs people that don't understand it to be able to communicate to the customers who don't understand it.
Yeah, and yet have some power and therefore discipline the industry to actually make it easy for them to be understood. Yeah, okay. Also interesting to hear your mention of Aravind. Yeah, I hope to perhaps have him on the show at some point. Yeah, I met him actually at the same summit where we met, the Geospatial Risk Summit organized by Priscilla Cole. Yeah, okay.
He's banging the drum, and he's a breath of fresh air to an industry that, in many ways has been a room full of the same people.
Yeah, yeah, and we should say that he has his own summit coming up in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
I think also in Manhattan, right?
Yep, that's correct. June 10th, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So yeah, I hope all attendees enjoy themselves there. I know that one of the guests recently on the previous podcast is going to be there, an edge computing platform called Novi. So yeah, okay. Another brief pit stop, if we could. So you've mentioned Moody's a couple of times. I understand they're a ratings agency, but more broadly, they're in the finance sector.
That's correct.
So what were you doing there?
So at Moody's, I was on their ESG team, responsible for energy, oil, and gas companies doing ESG ratings based on their assets, operations, human resource policies, governance, social policies. And one of the things that I found while I was there, that there was a lack of transparency on what was actually happening in the field. So working with oil companies with thousands of assets across Permian Basin, as an example, in Texas, it came time and time again during interviews and questionnaires when you asked if there were any issues, any methane leaks, the answer was always no. It was no, because they knew you're not going to get in a truck and drive, drive out there for thousands of miles and check. And at that time,
I know what some of these oil fields can be like. I spent 4.5 years in the Bergen oil field in Kuwait, and let me tell you, some bumpy roads.
That's right. That's right. And there's no way to verify. So
you know what? I would actually love to see a methane emissions analysis of the 4 oil assets in Kuwait. Yeah, I suspect there will be some interesting findings.
Yeah. But keep in mind, they're going to say there are no issues, right? Unless caught.
Yeah, okay. So that brings some meaning to what you were saying before about a geospatial foundation model to assist in the detection of these kinds of leaks. Okay, so I guess another reason why I want to dig into your experience in the finance sector is that I see geospatial, especially what geospatial can do in terms of Earth observation, as almost being the eyes and ears, really, for the finance industry. And there's a quote that that sticks in my mind here. I remember listening to a BlackRock podcast where they had the lead for their geospatial team on, and there was just a fantastic phrase that he had where the service he provides to BlackRock is geospatial insight as the world turns. Mm. And it's just to me, it's a real call to arms for what the geospatial discipline can be for the world, and provides some real nice direction, I think, for some quite a set of clients with thick wallets. So was there a sense that was what geospatial could do for Moody's as well, or how was your sense within the finance industry for what geospatial should do?
Yeah, so conceptually, it makes sense that the ability to look at assets and see if there's any change in assets over time is the greatest way, or really the only way, to truly determine risk. So having that concept and bringing that concept to the financial service industry is what I did at Maxar and Earth Daily, and spoke to the Goldmans, the Morgan Stanleys, the BlackRocks, the Citis, the JPMCs. And what I found is that there was agreement that this was the way to go, but they found the data too unwieldy. They didn't have the GIS experts and eyeballs to look at the data. So there was frustration, right? And the hope was that AI would make it easily digestible for them, to enable them to be a revenue resource for the satellite operators, of which they currently are not. There's no reason a BlackRock shouldn't pay as much as the NRO, because the return from getting satellite data to monitor assets across your portfolio, the ROI, would be a day, right? But there's a disconnect there, and hopefully AI will solve that.
You've really highlighted the whole point, really, of this podcast and this investigative effort. It's interesting to know that we are, maybe this is a pejorative term, but we're disorganized enough as an industry that we haven't managed to consistently, reliably tap this amazing market that Wall Street can offer us. Okay, so there's another call to arms. All right. And also, I'm hugely jealous that you have had an audience with all these high-powered financial firms. You are an inspiration. Okay.
Well,
So,
walking distance from my house, so it's easy enough. In many cases, they're in the same building, right? You could just go down to Wall Street and go to the elevator, and you can meet them all in the same day.
you're really rubbing it in, Mike. Can you please stop? Okay, so good to have that bit more of a context and flavor of the kind of inquiry that you've had in your career, Mike. Again, an inspiration. So could you step us through what it was like to do geospatial AI, specifically in Earth observation? And I have this sort of parallel thought in the back of my mind. I'm also anticipating that in your role at the US Artificial Intelligence Institute, are you proposing eventually to stand up some sort of geospatial certification for AI that's going to leverage the kind of experience you're talking about here? Sorry for the double-barreled question.
No, I had discussions yesterday on that topic. I've set up calls next week with geospatial industry leaders who are looking to create specific programs in AI for students, for companies in geospatial. So we're working on potentially putting together certifications, training, and consulting in that area, because there's a big demand. So we'll see how that turns out, but we're actively having those calls.
Right. Okay.
We'd love to have more.
Yeah, perfect. I'm glad, and I want to be one of the first to get that certification. All right. So maybe at the risk of putting too fine of a point on it, have you perhaps got an example from your career at one of these companies you worked at where there was a workflow or an analytical process in geospatial which didn't use AI, and you were responsible for introducing AI, or you witnessed the effect of it on that analytical process and attempt to gain insight?
Yeah, so that was the dream, right? To be able to take a process that didn't need 1,000 GIS analysts like the government has, that didn't need the ability to process unmanageable, unwieldy data to be able to fit in that workflow. The government has that ability to consume those large amounts of data. Corporations don't. So the concept was that, oh, okay, that data will become digestible through a foundation model, let's say created by Microsoft, that then will be the output in that workflow would be an answer without 100 or 1,000 eyeballs looking at it. That hasn't happened yet, right? There are no examples of that happening. And maybe it turns out like the concept of being able to look at all the assets across your entire portfolio, where it doesn't happen, right? There's a lot of hard decisions.
I'm fascinated by the challenge, though. I think we all are.
I found things that sound easy and would have a big ROI just haven't happened yet.
Interesting.
And maybe that's because the industry has one big customer, right? That one big customer pays a large amount of money at a high margin, where there was not necessarily the need for other customers. Now, potentially with any changes within not just the United States, but with other countries and sovereigns actually building or buying their own satellites, will the industry have to look elsewhere outside of those handful of large customers?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So perhaps what we could do then next is step through your experience in the initial creation of the geospatial foundation model.
Yeah. So I saw some tremendous success with open source data. So all of the initial models used or used, or were going to use open source data. The logical next step is to enhance that data with commercial data. What I found was that we weren't at that step just yet. So it was being proven out with open source. But I know that
Is this the standard things there are the Landsat archive, something from the European Space Agency. Is it those usual suspects, or have you got any other examples of open source data?
it's those usual suspects.
So Sentinel and Landsat, I suppose, then.
That's correct.
So if I could do some myth busting here, because what I've got, I haven't created a geospatial foundation model. I very much look forward to doing that on my little MacBook M2 sitting in front of me right now. So is it something that's achievable with a MacBook M2, or is the myth correct that I will have to have at my command a massive underground humming and buzzing and blinking data center?
You better have a shovel, Wilfred.
I'm going to bury my MacBook.
You got to start building out that data center and spending hundreds of millions on GPUs to be able to tackle the vast amount of Earth observation data there is.
Okay, so all of this does depend on these large data centers. That's interesting. Okay, so it sounds like I'm going to have to sign up for some subscription to what they've recently built in Abu Dhabi. All right. Okay, so then what in initiating these geospatial foundation models, what were some of the initial use cases that you used to get across the line justifying creating one of these?
Well, I think it was able to, the concept is that it could solve the use cases that were currently on the table, whether those were in agriculture, whether they're in mining, whether it was monitoring and mitigating wildfires, that this would be a better way to do it. This would be a manageable way to do it. So it was really the same use cases, but once again, enabling anyone and everyone to be able to do it without having to manage that unwieldy data set and without have an army of GIS analysts.
Okay, so of course, naturally, you would start with the same use cases as justify the entire Earth observation industry. So you have stepped through methane, you've stepped through wildfires, you've mentioned agriculture and mining. Could we have a little bit of extra detail on those two before the next sort of question I have, which is, at the risk of, again, I'm going to hit you with another double-barreled question, but after that, just for context, I'd be interested to know what use cases beyond the standard ones for Earth observation are enabled because we can unleash a vast underground liquid-cooled nuclear-powered data center. So yeah, just some extra detail on applications for agriculture and mining before new possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at any of the websites from any of the satellite operators, it's the same use cases. And those use cases have been on those sites and they've been talked about for 10, 20, maybe more years, right? It's disaster.
Since Gemini in 1962 or whenever it launched, right?
Exactly.
The first camera on something in space, yep.
Right. And I truly believe it's the use cases that haven't been discovered yet that will drive the new revenue in the industry. And one of the most exciting things I saw was the acquisition of Capella by IonQ, which is a quantum company, and how they were going to use the constellation, the SAR constellation, to do a lot of the encryption of the data in space. So that was a use case that most of the industry hadn't thought about or even didn't understand when it came out, but could be.
I don't understand it. What on earth do you mean encryption of data in space and quantum computing and SAR?
Yeah, so you can do the quantum computing on board in space, and there are some benefits to that. And you can get that data down in a more potentially a more timely manner.
Wow.
That's the reason I'm bringing that up is that's a use case that wasn't the ag climate, but
Gotcha.
for wildfire risk. It's going to be that it's going to be a use case like that to use the word again, saves the industry, right?
I actually love that you're using this so frequently. Okay. Um, yeah, I was not unfortunate enough to make any investments in those Earth observation companies, so at least I don't need to be saved. But yeah, I'm glad that you're providing a glimmer of hope for those that did. So hang on, you're saying because basically the cool thing about whatever's been put up in space at the moment is a lot of those objects have atomic clocks in them,
Yeah.
which is cool enough as it is to me. But you're saying that the next step is quantum computers. So to me, that implies that they're vaguely exiting the realm of science fiction, quantum computers,
Yeah.
if they're thinking about investing in chucking them up in orbit.
Yeah, and maybe there's a benefit to that in being there's a more timely response to the data, or even it's maybe down to things like temperature, right? Obviously, space is both hot, very hot, and very cold. So there could be that could be one of the benefits. But it's going to be a use case like that that no one predicts, that no one thought possible that will add the revenue generating channel outside of the government and what's today. It's not going to be the same four use cases that, agriculture and mining is not going to say, it's not going to, it's not going to pay the bills, right? It's something that's outside of that, potentially, something that is cutting edge like that acquisition.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think we've been putting you to good use in getting that commentary on what's on the edge. Okay. For example, BHP Billiton or Rio Tinto. As an Aussie, those names spring to mind quite
Right.
readily. They have billions to spare. I imagine, there's actually some people from NASA actually that set up some robotic Rio Tinto mine sites in the Pilbara in Western Australia, just to say that they're quite technically savvy. There's a control room sitting in Perth, thousands of miles to the south of the actual robotic trucks driving around, and the robotic trains, for example, for Fortescue, which is another mining company. So just to stick with mining a bit, do you set up a geospatial foundation model to assist in the detection of a specific type of mineral? Is that how you go in setting up a GFM, or are they more general than that? What do you do when you've got $1 billion and you're a mining company trying to exploit the power of GFMs?
Well, I think in the case of Rio Tinto, they have proprietary data that can be tied into satellite data, which is obviously extremely important because Australia is, as you know, a very large country, and there's some very remote areas. So being able to capture the entire landmass of the entire country, potentially on a daily basis, feeding that into a model along with the Rio Tinto proprietary data, can come up with some answers, some potential solutions that we could not on our own, right? Rio Tinto probably has geospatial analysts that look at data on a daily basis, right? And they understand the mining and extraction business. But
I have one that's a colleague from when I used to work at GHD in Brisbane on a Santos gas field. So I have a little bit of exposure to that. It'd be fascinating to have him on. Okay, yep. So your answer is, and again, it's just to speaking to the scale, you're inhaling continents like Australia, feeding them through some sort of automated ML AI driven set of algorithms to, in a natural language fashion, extract insight about where previously unknown deposits of minerals might be. Is this sort of how it goes And is it that a GFM could assist in the extraction of insight about any kind of mineral, or is it that you will need a GFM that is devoted to providing insight about a particular mineral?
Well, what you can do too is feed in every piece of knowledge ever created or written on geology into
Yeah,
the right. So now you'll have not just the world's expert on geology, but you'll have 100,000 of these world experts, as an example, in geology, solving these problems. So AI will become better than the best, and then it will expand to be 1,000 or 1,000,000 of those bests combined. And when you hit that, that kind of, brain power, you'll be able to answer questions that were unanswerable, or even you'll
mm,
be able to answer questions you'll never even know how it got to that. It will just say, drive out there, over there, and start, right? And you shouldn't question it, right? Because
yeah,
it will, in a year, 2 years, 10 years, it will have those capabilities on the super intelligence AGI side to be able to answer questions like that, because it'll have all the data on geology. It will
yeah,
have all the satellite data, remote sensing data. It will understand everything about Australia and past success and past failures and come up with those answers. And that's really, the power of of AI. And part of that is going to be replacing all of those analysts on the
yeah.
geos side. But that's
So,
where
I can add
AI,
some more insight here. Yeah, so I used to work for Central Petroleum.
yeah,
ASX colon CTP was the ticker. I was in an exploration team of 5 in Toowong, a suburb of Brisbane on the river. I used to catch the ferry from West End, one stop on the Brisbane River to Toowong every morning. I loved that exploration team. Just as a flavor of the kind of work as I did as the GIS officer, I was helping in planning the seismic routes for an exploration tenement they had in the southwestern corner of Queensland, this northeastern state of Australia, if that's not too confusing. We got all sorts of constraints data and terrain data to try our best to make sure those routes didn't take the seismic truck over a ravine or whatever. And then I was helping put satellite imagery on a geophysicist's iPhone. So when he got in the chopper to survey those proposed routes, they could see sort of where they were going, and that was to verify our efforts to plan those routes. So just to give people a flavor of what goes on in one of these little cowboy oil and gas exploration outfits. So that team, and then there was a lot of manual work that went on. They used software like Petrel, and you got all the 3D, 2D seismic, and you were using it to try and find the salt traps, and it was all human interpretation. So you're saying that all of that effort will somehow be corralled into an insight machine.
yeah, and that's where USAII comes in, is being able to upskill, reskill the employees that are currently focusing on the tasks that you just mentioned, right? And this is not a one-off example. This is across every industry, every current workflow, current process. And there's a high risk of leaving behind 80% of the workforce.
I wanted to say here as well, Mike, that because I've worked across 6 countries, I've done it all, right? But I always look back with such fondness, and I only worked for them from December 2012 to April 2013 when I went to Kuwait. But it was like a merry band of brothers. It sounds a bit silly, but like there's something about exploration and the thrill of the hunt and then
Yeah,
finding something. But the funny thing is, in the exploration tenements they had in Central Australia were the size of Japan. Like it wasn't a small. This is what happens with Australia, right?
right.
Like it looks small in Australia, but it was actually pretty nice. But they only had one producing oil well, and it was getting about 100 barrels a day. That was it. But just to say, like, I have such fondness for the camaraderie and the thrill of the hunt. And it's really interesting to think about going in as an AI consultant, as you were sort of proposing there with one of these certifications, that you would gain that skill and the kind of transformation that would lead to.
Yeah, and it's just an example of the the new jobs that could be created. How AI may also save a lot of workplace safety issues.
Right.
In this case, there must have been high risk being out in some of these remote areas.
The amount of training that we had to go through. But this is a bit adjacent, but it's also important to say. I'll never forget there's this old geologist who used to work as like the head geologist for the Northern Territory, which is like, the size of half of Europe, central northern part of Australia. But he came back from one of his trips to this oil well in this region, talking about the connections he made with the Aboriginal landowners. And the respect he had for their stories and their connection, their stewardship of that land. So it's, I think, also important to highlight the need for these AI-driven approaches to take account of, have awareness of, recognize the meaning of these groups and vulnerable groups more broadly. It's not just Aboriginal groups, but that there are vulnerable parts of society that can face a higher risk in society's tussle with how to exploit AI.
Yeah, and this is the main thing that drove me to work at USAI is the opportunity to enable everybody to succeed in a scenario where it could be catastrophic, right? If all of a sudden, and it's going to happen fast, where a large part of the population is going to be displaced in the current role they're in. And if that happens, and if those people and employees and citizens are not given the opportunity to learn, upskill, reskill, and go to new positions, it's going to be devastating to society. And I think we need to look back on the Industrial Revolution when there was a time where 90% of the population fed 100% of the population, meaning you and I would be farmers, right?
Right.
That went from 90% feeding 100% to
that was all mechanized. Yeah.
Yeah, but it went to like what now 2% of the
Right.
population, if not less, feeds 100. So how did we manage that transition? Because we're going to have to look at that use case to learn from what worked and what didn't work. And that's, one of the things that USAI is focusing on is that no one's left behind.
Right.
Because if we don't look at that, then, they're, could turn into a bad movie.
Right. Yeah. And, that maybe another way to say it is that the society already has enough significant gaps and inequalities and groups of vulnerable people that are easily exploited as society currently stands.
Yeah.
There is, at the risk of being melodramatic, there is a possibility that an outcome of humanity augmented by AI, that the existing inequalities are simply magnified. And the outcome for vulnerable groups is that they are marginalized even more. And you don't want to think about what the possibilities are for them once that happens. My natural response here is that the first step should be that it's in fact the vulnerable groups in society that are given AI first, and that hopefully the gaps that they are currently trying to navigate become easier to navigate.
Yeah, and you can do that by countries, by communities. When you look at a country like Malaysia being so aggressive in the training and reskilling and upskilling of their citizens and building out an AI workforce, building out AI programs in schools, that that needs to be replicated, right? Because if a
That's really
country,
nice to hear.
yeah, if a country doesn't do that, then it's not going to be able to compete. If a company
Yeah.
doesn't do that, it's not going to be able to compete.
I'm butting in here, but I have through my multicultural career, and actually this takes me back to when I was a student at the University of Melbourne. There was a significant Malaysian cohort of students there, and I know from these encounters and a friend of mine that I made from my master's degree in geospatial, that in Malaysian society there's a division between the Bumiputera, which is the indigenous Malay population, and the Chinese immigrants, as it were. And there's some inequality already there because the Chinese immigrants appear to be more adept at business. And so they have more power, more financial power, financial capital in Malaysian society. So is there an effort in the government to use AI to address this inequality, or at least to ensure that the distribution of this new knowledge and insight doesn't find expression in this current division?
Yeah, and the government of Malaysia is very forward thinking on the way it's going to train its employees, its citizens. I'm going to be going to Malaysia to work with the government on some specific projects with USAII, and I found that what I know today is the country's approach is should be replicated across the globe, and it's exciting to see what Malaysia is doing. And the countries who don't replicate that are going to be left behind. Just like the individuals who don't take the time to get a subscription or even use a free version of ChatGPT, or Anthropic, or Mistral, or DeepSeek, will be left behind.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think that's a nice way to end things, Mike, and also draws people's attention to your next steps and sort of monitoring USAII's impact on the world. So yeah, thanks, Mike, for coming on and being the inspiration for all of us.
Yeah, it was fun, Wilfred.